Hello and welcome everyone to this awesome talk arranged by the ISA Kolkata Campus Radio and ISA Kolkata Science Club. And this event is a series of talks which we call the Science Month. It was initially planned to run a month, but we are extending it for 3 months now. And so this is probably our 10th talk. And so we welcome everyone present here. We have with us today a really interesting researcher. She's Poornima Ramesh. She did her BSMS in physics from ISA Kolkata, after which she directly joined a PhD in TU Munich. And during her PhD, her lab moved to the University of Tübingen, where she is doing her PhD now in machine learning and its applications in various fields of science, such as neuroscience and statistics. So without wasting any more of your time, I would like to pass the microphone to Ms. Poornima. So Ms. Poornima, go ahead and present your presentation.
Cool. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I will share my screen. All right. I hope everyone can see this. I'm going to be talking about my research in the applications of generative adversarial networks. This is going to be a machine learning talk, and please feel free to interrupt with questions. And this is work that I did mostly at TU Munich and at the University of Tübingen in the machine learning and science group. Before I talk about my research, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to machine learning. So essentially, the central sort of theme in machine learning is neural networks, and these are the tools or the vehicles with which we do machine learning. And the first question to ask is, what is a neural network? And the problem that you want to solve in any machine learning application is that you have some input, X, and you have some output, Y, that you want to connect it to. So your input could be images, it could be text, it could be some other kind of data that you've measured. And you want to connect these images, for example, to labels like bird, dog, or car, which indicate what's in the image. Or you might want to convert this text into audio, or you might want to take your measurements that you've made and get some other quantity out of them. And the problem that you're then trying to solve is how to map this input to this output. These are typically very complex data sets, so images are high dimensional. It's not easy to convert text into numbers, and therefore learning a function that would map this input to the output is a hard problem. So essentially what you want to do is to learn some function of X, and this function has parameters theta that you can change or tune, and you want to learn this function that would take X to Y. And what the neural network does is it learns that function. Essentially, it represents this function, and these neural networks are nice because they can be incredibly flexible. So you can have all sorts of complicated input data and all sorts of complicated output data, and in theory, a neural network would be able to learn a mapping between the two of them. So to just summarize what I said, the neural network is just an extremely flexible function, and most, if not all, of machine learning is just about learning this flexible function. So how do you train your network? Let's start with a concrete example. Imagine that you've measured the height of lots of different people, and you've also simultaneously measured their weight, and you want to connect the values that the height values that you want to connect the values that you've measured for the height to the values that you've measured for the weight. So essentially you want to learn a mapping from the height to the weight. And additionally, what you want to do is, suppose you get a new value of the height. So you've met a new person, you've measured their height, and you want to predict what their weight would be. So I've just plotted this data set here, and you have some height on the x-axis and some weight on the y-axis. And essentially what you want to do is then, given a new value of the height, you want to predict what the weight is going to be. So this is just a prediction problem. And you want to learn a function that would take you from the height to the weight. I'm going to tell you the solution already. This function is just a line, and the line function takes in the height, multiplies it with some slope, and this slope is the parameter of your function, and this function will then spit out the weight. All right. If you were to then represent this function in terms of a network, then you basically parameterize the network with the slope, and initially you make a guess for what that slope would be, and most probably that guess is going to be wrong, and therefore the line that you learn is also the line that you have from the network is also going to be wrong. Now the question is, how do you correct this line such that it actually matches the true solution? What does it mean to correct it? Essentially, you just want to learn what the correct value of the slope would be. And you tell the network that it's wrong using something called a loss function. What does the loss function do? Well, you've already measured a bunch of heights and weights, so you know, at least for some values of the height, what the weight should be. And you can also get the network to predict what the weight would be for these heights that you already know, right? And obviously at the beginning, because the slope is wrong, the network is also going to predict weights that are completely wrong. And you can just calculate the difference between the weight that it should be and the wrong weight that the network gives you. You square the difference, you sum over all of the heights and weights that you know, and you get some value. Yeah. This loss function, you've probably seen it before. It's called the mean squared error. And this is also what I've plotted here. This is basically the value of the loss as a function of the slope of this line that the network is representing. Okay, and when the network is quite badly wrong, the loss is going to be really high. But when the network has the correct answer, then the loss function is going to be minimum, right? So essentially, you can use the value of this loss to tell the network where it's going wrong and help it correct the slope value. So if you do this, you use the loss function to tell the network to correct itself, you would see that it now updates to some new slope, which is still wrong, but not quite as badly as the first guess that it made. And so your loss would go down a little bit. And if you keep doing this, then eventually your network will just learn the correct value and the correct value of the slope, and you will have learned the solution to this mapping, how to get from heights to widths, right? And this is basically how you would train your network. And the thing to note is that it's really important to have a good loss for the network in order to learn this input-output function. What do I mean by that? Let's suppose that we change the same problem a little bit. Yeah, I still measured the heights of many different people, but now using the height, I want to predict if someone is male or female. Yeah, I'm indicating male here by 1 and female by 0, and now your network is going to be some function of the height, and it's also going to have some parameters theta and these are the thetas that you want to learn. But now I'm still going to keep the same loss function. I will keep the mean squared error. Yeah. Now remember that the value that you're trying to predict can only take two numbers, either 1 or 0. So male or female is just going to be 0 or 1, but the height is continuous valued. So when you actually calculate your loss, the real value for your output is going to be either 1 or 0, and what the network outputs is also going to be 1 or 0. And if you calculate the error, if your network is wrong, then it's going to say 0 when it should be 1, and then your loss function will just be 1. And if your network is correct, then it's going to say 0 when something should be 0, and then your loss function is going to be 0. So basically, your loss function can only really take two values. It could either be 1 or it could be 0 and nothing in between, which basically means that this loss function is completely uninformative. It will not help your network get better at guessing what the function should be that maps the height to male and female, and therefore you cannot train your network with this loss. So what you would actually need to do is, instead of the mean squared error, you would have to use something called the binary cross entropy loss. I will not get into the details of what this is, but it's a different loss function that would then help you learn the correct function, which in this case is a sigmoid. Okay, so the summary of this section of the talk is basically this: neural networks are extremely flexible functions, but you need a good loss to learn the function that maps some input to the output, and this function strongly depends on the kind of data that you have. So if you have continuous valued data, then such as weights, then you can use a particular kind of function. If your data is binary valued, so it's just zeros or ones, then you need a different function. So the loss function strongly depends on the data. Okay? Any questions at this point? I'm guessing.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question says it's by Ankan, and they are asking what kind of operation allows us to update the slope.
Okay.
The next time the error would reduce.
Okay. So I didn't want to get into this too much in the talk because I thought it would take too much time. But essentially, the way you would update the network values is by something called gradient descent, and this is if you guys have done numerical computation, then typically this is just something like the Euler method is a method of gradient descent, where you would compute the derivative of the loss function with respect to the parameter of the network, and then you would just use this derivative to push the parameter in the correct direction. Again, I will not say more than this, but I do have a slide at the end of the talk which will give you more resources where you can go to find out more about this. Any other questions?
Not yet, but thank you so much for the answer. And Ankan, if you have any more doubts, you can write in the chat box, and others too are encouraged to ask questions. So yeah, Poornima, go ahead.
All right. So just to keep recap again, neural networks are flexible. You need a good loss function, and the loss function depends on the data. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about generative adversarial networks. These are a certain kind of neural network and a certain kind of machine learning method, a specialized one, which I use a lot in my research. And what these generative adversarial networks, or GANs as they are called, do is essentially they answer the question of how to pick a loss that best fits the kind of data you're trying to learn. So we've seen that you need to be very careful about what kind of loss you pick when you want to train your network. And the thing to realize is, well, the loss is just another mapping, right? It takes some input and it spits out a number that just tells you whether your network how correct or wrong your network is. Okay, so essentially the loss function is also another mapping, and if this is a mapping that's typically quite hard to write down, then we know what to do. We should use a neural network. Yeah. So what a generative adversarial network framework does is it asks, can we learn the loss along with an input-output network? So you're just going to learn the input-output network that would take in some data and spit out some output that you want. But along with this, it's also going to learn the loss that would train the input-output network. How does it work? Well, you have one network known as the generator, which will take in some input and spit out some output. In this case, I've taken an example of images. And at the beginning, when you haven't trained your network at all, these images are going to look really bad. But what you want the network to be producing are images like this that are nice and clean. And you need a way to tell the network to go from images that look really bad to images that look really good. Again, it's because these are images, it's very hard to write down a loss function that would tell you how different these images are. It's not easy to write down math for this. And so what you would do instead is use a second network. This network is called the discriminator. And what the discriminator does is it will take in the really nice images that you want to have, and it will spit out it will spit out a number saying that this input is real, and it will then also take in images from the generator that look really bad, and then spit out a number that says this image is fake. And if you put everything together, the way to think about it is this. The generator is like an art forger that's trying to produce images that look like the real thing. And the discriminator is an art expert that looks at the images that the generator produces and what the actual images should look like, and then says which one is real or fake. And essentially, when you train both of these networks together, what happens is that the generator tries to produce images that would fool the discriminator into thinking that these are real. And what the discriminator does is it tries to get better and better at telling apart these real images and these fake images from the generator. And when you train both the networks for a really long time, what ends up happening is that the generator learns to produce images that look like the real thing, because the best way to fool the discriminator is to actually just produce real images. And just to summarize what I've just said, the generator just learns an input-output function between whatever input and output you like. The discriminator learns a loss for the generator so that you can train it. And this thing is called adversarial because each network tries to beat the other. So the generator tries to beat the discriminator and the discriminator tries to beat the generator. Questions?
Yeah, we don't have any questions for now, but I encourage the audience to ask more questions.
Okay, cool. Then I will move on. If I'm assuming everyone's understood what GANs do. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about how I apply GANs to specific problems in certain areas of science. Okay, the first problem that I apply it to is to learn to reproduce neural data. So this is an application in neuroscience, and the question that we're asking in my research is how does the brain process information? So you know that you take in a lot of sensory information every day. So you see things, you hear things, you smell things. There's a lot of input to your brain. And the neurons in the brain take all of this information and respond to it by producing lots of spikes. And in order to understand how the brain works, how it processes all of this information, we need to know how these neurons behave. So essentially, we want to know how the brain converts all of this input, this stimuli, into spikes. So how do these spikes encode the information that is contained in whatever input that you get? How do you do this? Well, what you want to do is you've got data essentially measuring what the spikes in the brain look like, and you want to have a neural network that produces exactly the same kind of data. And if you do that, if you now have a neural network that produces spikes that look exactly like the spikes that come from the brain, then you can pull apart the neural network and see what it's doing in order to produce this data given some input. right? And this will hopefully help you understand what the brain is doing, because you hope that the neural network is performing similar processing that the brain does. How do you get the neural network to produce data that looks exactly like the stuff that comes out of the brain? Well, you want to match certain features. So you want to make sure that the data that the neural network produces has the same mean and the variance as the real data. You want to make sure that the correlation between the data from different neurons matches that of the real data. And you also want to match something else called a population spike histogram. These three features all need to match between what the network produces and what you got from the brain. But it's incredibly hard to write down a loss function that would make sure all of these things match and then use it to train the neural network. It's hard to write down math for this. But we already know about GANs. GANs help you just learn the loss function along with the network. So this is precisely what I did as well. I used a GAN to learn a neural network that would produce all of this data using all of these features. How does the GAN work? Well, you have some data from the brain. What does this mean? We have an experimental lab where there are mice, and these mice are shown a bunch of images, and then you measure the spikes that the brain of the mouse produced when it saw these images. What you also have is what I also set up is a neural network which takes in those exact same images that the mouse saw and then produces spikes that corresponding to these images. And now what you want to do is to find a way to match these generated spikes to the real thing. And again, because it's hard to write down a loss function, what you would do is to use a discriminator. What the discriminator will do is it will take in these real spikes and say real. We will take in these generated spikes and say fake. And then you train both the generator and the discriminator together. And once training is finished, whatever the generator produces will look like the real spikes from the brain. And then you can pull apart the generator to see how it's transforming the stimulus into generated spikes. And that should tell you a little bit about what the brain is doing in transforming these stimulus into spikes. This is the first application. Any questions at this point?
No questions yet, but I think once the talk ends, we'll see more questions.
Okay. So this is the first application of GANs that I worked on. The second application is statistical inference. What exactly is statistical inference? So imagine you have some model known as a simulator, and this model is just something that's your guess at how something in the real world works. So it could be a model for simulating the climate. It could be a particle physics model where you're simulating particle collisions. And all of these models typically have parameters. So parameters are things that you have to set in the model. So if you had a particle physics model, then you would have to set the physical constants. If you had a climate model, then you would have to set things like temperature, humidity, etc. And once you've chosen these parameters and you run the model forward, then it will produce some data for you. Again, this data, if it was a climate model, would look like ocean currents or air currents. If it was a particle physics model, then it would basically tell you which particles collide, how much energy did it take, and at what time the collision happened, things like this. All right? And then one question that you can ask is, suppose I observed some data. Suppose I observed certain ocean currents, or suppose I observed certain collisions. What parameter generated that data? So going from the data back to the parameter that could have generated it, this problem is called inference. Okay? So you want to know what is the parameter that generated the data that I'm seeing. and this and the procedure of going back, the way of doing this is called inference. I will give you a more concrete example. So imagine you have something called a shallow water model. This is a model that's typically used in climate science to model tsunamis or floodplains. And what this model does is it models a shallow water basin which has a certain depth profile. And given this depth profile, the model tells you what the waves on the surface of the water body look like. Okay? And so if you were to put it back in the inference framework, your parameter is the depth profile. If you choose a particular depth profile and give it to the shallow water model, it will produce waves on the surface of the water body. And now you're asking, suppose somewhere out in the ocean, I observed certain surface waves. Then what is the depth profile at the bottom of the ocean that could have led to these waves? So, given these surface waves, you want to know what the depth profile could have been. So, this is the inference that you want to do. You want to infer the depth profile given the surface waves. Going from surface waves to depth profile is really hard because this is complicated data. The surface wave is essentially a 100 by 100 matrix of surface wave height, and the depth profile again is a really big vector, and it's hard to do this input-output mapping where your input is the surface wave and your output is the depth profile. And so we know what to do when we have problems with input-output mappings. We use a neural network to do this inference for us. How does it work? You pick the parameters that you want. In our case, this is the depth profile. You plug it into your simulator, which is our shallow water model, and you get some data out of it, so the surface waves. And now you have a network where you give it the data, which is the surface wave, and it will spit out a guess for what the parameter is that generated this data. So it will generate a few parameters for you. Okay? So now your neural network is doing inference in that it is guessing what the parameters are that generated a particular data. Okay? And how do you train this network? You would basically use a loss function that computes the distance, some distance measure between these generated parameters and the actual parameters that gave rise to this data. Okay? Again, when you have something that's super high dimensional and very complicated, like a depth profile, then it's not easy to write down this loss function. You can't do math with it. So again, we know what to do when you have difficulties with loss functions. You use a GAN. How does this work? You have parameters or the depth profile that you choose. You plug it into the simulator, which will produce the surface waves for you. You give the surface waves now to the generator network of the GAN, and the generator will produce parameters for you. And now the discriminator just looks at the real parameters, the fake parameters, and then it says real or fake. And now you can train both the networks together, and if once you've trained it for a really long time, then what the generator will do is actually produce parameters that really in truth generated your data. So this is how you do statistical inference with GANs. All right. With that, I am done with my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I also want to thank the members of my lab, Machine Learning and Science. Professor Dr. Yaqub Makka is my supervisor, and all of these colleagues who helped out, or who are also a major part of the research that I do. And with that, I'm done. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you for this really amazing talk. So we have some questions. One question is by Alice, and they are asking, how do you train the generator or discriminator?
So this goes back to the same question that came up before. How do you train the network in general? Again, I skipped over some details because I didn't think I would have time to address them. But essentially, what happens is the discriminator now is also a neural network that you have to learn, and so you have to write down a loss function for this neural network. But it's actually quite easy to write down a loss function for the discriminator, because now it's just taking some really big data and producing real or fake, which is just one number. And you would use something called the binary cross entropy loss, which I mentioned before for the 0-1 data case here. So you would just use this loss function for the discriminator, and then for the generator, the discriminator network is the loss. So you would use you would just use the discriminator to update the generator. And when I say update, both of these things involve gradient descent, which again I did not talk about. But again, you would just compute the derivative of the binary cross entropy loss with respect to the discriminator parameters, and you would use that to update the discriminator. And then for the generator, you would use the derivative of the discriminator function with respect to the generator parameters, and then use that to update the generator. I hope this was clear.
Yeah, I hope that was clear, Alice. But if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. The next question is by Phil, and they're asking, how do neural networks learn to beat each other?
How do the neural networks learn to beat each other? Okay, so again, it depends on the way the loss is set up. So essentially, the way you write down the loss, what is happening is that again, I didn't put math in because I thought 8:30 at night is too late to take in a lot of math, especially at the end of a hard day of lectures. But essentially, what happens is when you write down the loss function for the discriminator, you minimize this loss function because you want to make sure that the error that you're making is small. And then when you train the generator, implicitly what you're doing is you're maximizing the same loss. So essentially, the discriminator tries to make some quantity decrease, and the generator tries to take that same quantity and make it increase. So they basically have opposing objectives, and this is why they're trying to beat each other. So every time you update the discriminator, it tries to pull the loss function in one direction, and the generator tries to pull that same value in another direction, and they're basically like playing like a tug of war. And it only ends when the generator does exactly. It only ends when the generator fools the discriminator. So you want it in the end to win. Again, I hope that was clear.
Yeah, that seemed pretty clear to me. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask. And the next question is by Aditya, and they're asking, what models do you use for generating data, and what type of input are you using for generator?
In which, can you clarify in which application?
Yeah, Aditya, if you can, then please write in the chat box which application you're talking about. But in general, what would you like to say?
So in general, again, what input you use, what generator you use, what discriminator you use, all of these strongly depend on the application itself. So, for example, with the neural data problem, my generator was taking images as input and spitting out spikes, which are basically ones and zeros, like big vectors of ones and zeros. And you also have to carefully sort of set up the generator in order to do this transformation. So you have to think about the network architecture. I didn't talk about network architecture in the talk either, but this is something that you have to worry about. For the statistical inference problem, again, for this particular example, which is what I worked on, my input to the generator was the surface waves, and the output was the depth profile. Yeah.
So Aditya has clarified. Like in your case, is it an image data or structured data?
Well, image data is structured in that the pixels of the image have a very concrete sort of organization, but in general, for my applications, it again strongly depends on what exactly I'm doing. So for the neuroscience application, the input was image data, and the output was spikes. For the statistical inference application, the input was surface waves, which is again structured, and in some sense it looks like an image because it's two-dimensional and has values at each element of the matrix. But yeah, so for the inference, it was surface waves, and the output was one long vector which represented the depth.
Okay, cool. So I think Aditya, your query is answered. But if not, you can feel free to write. The next question is a pretty interesting one by Safarul, and they're asking that GANs or GANs will only work for input outputs that have uniformity in relation, like neural patterns or data parameters. For non-linear phenomena, can we modify the GAN?
Yes, this is a very it's a really good question. So yes, the point of using a neural network in any sense, not just in GANs, is that you can learn input-output functions that are extremely nonlinear, that are extremely complicated. So if you remember at the beginning of my talk, I said your input could be anything, right? It could be an image and you want to connect it to labels. It could be text and you want to connect it to audio. And these are highly nonlinear functions. And yes, you can learn a neural network to approximate these really nonlinear functions. If you just wanted I mean, of course, neural networks can also do linear functions, but yes, you can also design your network to learn highly nonlinear functions. And in my applications, in my research application as well, these are highly nonlinear problems. It's not easy to go from some weird noise to good images. It's not easy to go from images to spikes, or from surface waves to depth profile. So yes, you need highly nonlinear networks to do this for you.
Really interesting. So, Safarul, if you have any more questions, feel free to ask. So while we wait for more questions, I had a question myself. So in the case of where you're talking about the neuroscience and the data, so how can you be sure that the connections that the neural network or the machine learning algorithm produces is same as what's happening in the brain, as in maybe the same spikes can be achieved by different patterns? How can you be sure about that?
That's a really good question, and the answer is we cannot be sure. There's a lot of research going on into this particular question of whether your neural network really does represent what's going on in the brain. And again, we have to carefully design the architecture of the neural network in order to be able to say something about whether or not it imitates what the brain is doing. And there are also ways of analyzing the neural networks to so the parameters of the neural network, and then connecting it to certain features of certain other things that we know about the brain in order to figure out whether it's actually doing something similar to the brain. But you're right. We have no way of knowing for sure whether we are correct or not. All of this would just be a hypothesis, and hopefully, in the spirit of scientific inquiry, it would be a testable hypothesis, so that someone can go do an experiment and figure out if we're right.
Indeed, that's pretty interesting. So As we wait for more questions, we can ask a general question, as in what made you interested in this particular field of machine learning? Maybe if you could tell a bit to our young viewers.
What got me interested in machine learning? Well, so in the particular fields of research that I'm working in, so neuroscience and statistical inference, it's really hard to solve any problems in closed form. So I mean, my training is in physics, so I unfortunately have to use use a physics example. So typically, when you have a problem in physics, you would write down a differential equation, and then you would sort of make simplifying approximations, and then use that to sort of model a physical system, right? And in neuroscience and in statistical inference, it's really hard to do this, because when you make simplifying approximations, you lose a lot of the subtleties that sort of make your model good enough to study whatever it is that you want to study. And the really nice thing about machine learning is that because this neural network can handle a lot of complexity, you don't really have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions. Of course, this comes with certain problems, because a neural network is a very abstract thing. It's hard. It's also very hard to analyze, as in the example of when we were trying to get it to imitate the brain. But what machine learning allows is that you have a lot of flexibility in solving these problems. So even if you can't write down equations in closed form, even if you can't do math in closed form, machine learning is really nice, because you can still try and solve some of these problems, which is why I'm very interested in them.
That's really cool. So I don't think we have any more questions, but as a conclusion, what advice would you like to give to young researchers or young undergraduate students who are thinking of making a career in academia?
What advice would I have? Well, I haven't worked outside of academia, so I can't give you a comparative analysis. But I think doing a PhD, so I can only give you advice about doing a PhD, and doing a PhD is quite hard compared to doing a master's or a bachelor's, because essentially there are no markers of whether you're doing well or not. So you don't get graded, you don't have exams, you don't have you have no way of really knowing. So essentially what this means is that there's a lot of uncertainty, and so my advice would be to think hard about whether how much passion you have for the subject and sort of like the science, because it's really the field, like doing a PhD is super uncertain, and so most days what really keeps you going is just your interest in the subject, and just to think about these things before you choose to do it. I mean, you could still do really great science when you're not putting yourself through all of that uncertainty. So just my advice would be to think about it. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the advice, and I hope it doesn't intimidate some of the audience, but you get to do such cool science.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't mean to, like, I don't mean this as sort of like any sort of discouragement. More that you should think about these things, because science by its very nature involves a lot of uncertainty, but it can also be very rewarding. So when things work, it is the most awesome feeling in the world. But also there are many days when things don't work, and those are the days when you have to remember why science is nice.
Indeed. So thanks a lot for this really interesting session, Poornima, and I hope the audience also loved it. But if you have any more questions, then you can probably email Poornima, and she would be happy to answer.
Yes, I would be very happy to get questions. And also, I just quickly wanted to show you this slide, which is a bunch of resources for anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about machine learning and its basics. I'm also happy to answer questions by email.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We'll pass on the email of yours, email ID. Yes. Thank you so much for being here, and please subscribe to this channel as we keep on having talks every week, and we would love it if we have a lot of attendance as we have today. So we'll end the stream now, and I hope you have a nice day.
Cool. Thanks.